Hello everybody, my name is Peter Wainwright. I am your facilitator for tonight's webinar. We have with us two panelists, Dr. Katrina Pritchard, who is a senior lecturer at in organizational studies at the Open University Business School, and we have a senior HR manager, Martin Hall from BMW. I just want to warn you that we are recording this webinar, so the chat and what you say in the chat, so do be careful about sensitivities, and otherwise people will be able to access that later on. So if we move on to the next slide, you'll see the objectives, and then I'll take you through to the agenda, and I'll introduce you to our panelists in a bit more detail. So could we have the next slide, please? Hello, we seem to have a slight snag. Here you are. Right. Okay, so these really are the two objectives. Some of you would have been at the 12th of February masterclass in London, where we were talking about age diversity. So if you were there, it's a chance for you to refresh some of the learning from the day. If you weren't there, you'll be having a great insight into some video clips and discussions with our panelists and building on the questions that you posed to us. So really it's very much about your learning, gaining insight into tackling this very important issue that's presenting us. So here we have a slide with the agenda. I'm going to ask Dr. Katrina Pritchard to give us an overview in a second of the masterclass. And you'll see the menu we have for tonight. We have 4 video clips. Each one is about 7 minutes long. And after some of them, we have a poll, but after each of them, we have a discussion, and then we have a final Q&A and a wrap-up. So I'll just introduce our two panelists. So, Katrina, you've been involved in research looking at age at work. Could you tell us a bit about your interest in this topic, please? Hello, Katrina? Hello, Katrina. I'm going to ask our technical expert, Barbara, do we have Katrina on the line, please? Okay, we'll come back to her. Hopefully we've got Martin there. Martin, hello. How are you?
Hi, Peter. I'm good, thank you.
Brilliant. Could you just tell us a little bit about the focus of your work in HR in BMW in relation to this topic, please?
Yeah, it's a topic that's very close to our hearts. Obviously, we have an ageing workforce. We also have to look at demographics and skill shortages. So it's something we try and plan ahead and have a look at, a whole host of measures to support an ageing workforce. We need a sustainable organisation, and we need to gain competitive advantage from doing that.
Brilliant. Okay, well, lovely. We'll be building upon that and hearing from our attendees, really, of their experiences in response to the videos. But before we get Katrina, just the kind of the format, I'm sure most of you have got the hang of this and you've been on other similar webinars. You can pose your questions in the chat. We'll respond to themes that keep kind of bubbling up. If there are lots and lots of questions, we may not be able to respond to all of them, and if we have time between talking, we will respond in the chat as well as a panelist and myself. But while the videos are running, do feel free to chat away as ideas occur to you. Now, I'm just going to check if we've now got communications with Katrina.
Yes, apologies, my phone decided to shut down there just at the critical moment.
Brilliant. So, Katrina, could you just give us a brief overview of your interest in this work from your research, please?
Yes, certainly. I've been researching age at work since 2011. In fact, there will be or is a link up on the Business Perspectives webpage and blog to a research blog called Age at Work, and we also run a Twitter account on that. And we are looking at issues largely around stereotyping of generations and age and the impact these have in organisations of all shapes and sizes, and the problems with stereotyping at work.
Brilliant. Well, that's, again, I'm sure perhaps all of us have our own views and perceptions about age. Some of them are attitudes, some of them are stereotypes, some are useful, sometimes they get in the way. So that would be really interesting to see see how that pans out. Now, Katrina, I knew you weren't there on the day in London, but could you just give us a flavour of the scope of the topics of that event, please?
Certainly. The aim of the day was really to bring together a mix of academic research and people who are dealing with age diversity at work on a daily basis. So there were two research-led presentations from Professor David Wilson talking about youth transitions, and from Dr. Rebecca Whiting, who was looking at some points from our research on stereotypes. And then they were combined with Peter Cheese, who's the Chief Executive of the CIPD, giving a sort of perspective from the CIPD of issues around age at work. And then some more specific presentations with people working with issues of age in their organisations, Lydia Fern from Barclays, Paul Deemer and Robin Palmer from the NHS, and Martin, who's here with us tonight, talking about his work at BMW.
Brilliant. Yes, that sounds like a very varied agenda, and it's very interesting how the title is about age diversity, obviously in contrast to sometimes people talk about the ageing workforce, or it's focused around older people. So we're really looking at the whole span of age ranges and this concept of age diversity, and what can we do as leaders and managers to navigate our way through this for thriving organisations. So without further ado, we're going to move on to video clip number 1, which is Peter Cheese from the CIPD giving his perspective. So Barbara, when you're ready, if you could launch video 1, please.
Thinking about the kind of people that we employ and recruit into our businesses and how we manage them. Well, let's start with the younger generation, Gen Y, or even Gen Z, who's coming up fast on their heels. What are some of the characteristics of Gen Y? As I said, I first started to notice business leaders ask me about Gen Y and what the problem was with them back in the late 90s. I think now we look at Gen Y in slightly different ways. At one level, it is a generation that we can all learn from. And this is an interesting thing. There are people like Don Tapscott, who's written endlessly on the subject of Gen Y. In fact, Gen Y is the most researched generation in history, I should think. And he makes the point that maybe for the first time a generation is coming into work who can teach the older generation a thing or two. And those old kind of hierarchical paradigms of work where we think, well, if I'm older and I've been here longer, then my job is to tell you what you should know, not to listen to what you've got to tell me. And of course Gen Y do come in with very particular skills. Not least, they're much more digitally literate than most people, or a lot of people in work. I still see managers doing things like this, or some bosses with great pride telling me that they don't answer emails, they dictate responses to their PAs. And you think, well, they've got to move on, haven't they? I mean, that's not the modern world. And my goodness, if a young person comes into an organisation and sees their boss is a complete technophobe, and then finds out the HR team or the IT team has said, well, you can't access the internet, you can't bring your own device. I know, by the way, the systems you've got to use in the organisation look like they came out of the 1900s. That is not an environment that young people are going to be very happy staying in, and nor should they. And incidentally, that's not a good environment for work of any kind. So young people are coming into work with different expectations. First of all, that we're digitally literate, and then we have organisations that use and embrace technology in effective ways. Secondly, that we do things to support people better. I mean, one of the great things that Gen Y, I think, has made us think about much more in work is that they expect to be told or supported or be given regular feedback as to how they're performing. And I don't mean once a year with some rather stilted conversation where the boss is trying to remember what on earth it was he actually did. I mean, regular feedback, almost day in, day out, but certainly every week, and they want to know when they've done things well, and they want to know when they've done things badly. Now, why do you suppose that's happening? Well, I've got Gen Y children. On the fridge at home, and I'm sure many of you got this, there are all sorts of certificates and badges and rosettes which say things like, came fifth, happiest student. Well, that never happened in my generation, I can tell you. We might have got a badge or a certificate for coming first. We certainly didn't get one for just turning up. And at school and as parents, we've encouraged this kind of thinking. We're more involved with our children. So they do come into work with that sort of expectation. In fact, people talk about helicopter parenting, that the parents are always hovering over the children. In some companies and some organizations that recruit a lot of young people, they teach the recruitment managers and the line managers how to deal not just with the recruit, but with the parents. Because young person comes in, has a job interview, perhaps doesn't get the job, walks out, mum and dad sat outside, mum and dad come barging through the door and say, how could you not give my darling a job, right? Or how could you possibly have said in your performance rating that this person wasn't very good? So there are upsides and downsides. To me, the positive is that Gen Y is bringing into the workforce to say, we need regular feedback, coaching and support, and that is your job as my manager. And what is wrong with that? Just because we as a generation were frankly pretty rubbish at it, didn't make it right, sort of obscure routes of career development which nobody understood, climbing greasy poles, staying in organizations for 20, 30 years, that is the old paradigm. The new paradigm is it's life of jobs. 15, 20, 25 jobs that people expect to have during their careers. They will move quickly. They expect to be engaged and they expect to be supported and they expect to have regular feedback and they expect their line managers to coach them and support them as to what they should do next. And that is a very different paradigm. And as I said, I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily. But it does mean that amongst other things, we have got to train the line managers better. And it's one of my recurring themes of all this stuff. If you think about any of these aspects of a modern workforce and a modern organization, all this diversity stuff, because I've just talked about one, I said there were many dimensions of diversity. Generational diversity is one, and it's really the first time, probably in the last 15, 20 years, we've ever thought about generational diversity. We've tended to think about gender and ethnicity. So we've got gender diversity, ethnicity, age diversity, we've got diversity in ways in which people work, we've got aspirational diversity and all these other things. So ways in which people work, which is so important, more flexible working environments, more flexi hours, more job sharing, more people working on contracts, not necessarily in full-time employment. These are all features of the modern workforce and they are not going away, they're going to continue. And they are good things if you do them right, because it allows organizations to recruit people from very different and diverse places. And that is important for business, it's important for sustainable, responsible businesses that work well with the communities they serve, and it's also important in terms of attracting and retaining more diverse talent. And more diverse talent helps drive innovation. I'll give you another thing that line managers are going to understand in an age-diverse workforce, a more diverse workforce, which is performance management. Performance management, I would argue, is one of the most important processes in HR. Because at the end of the day, what's performance management about? Well, performance management should be about improving performance. Sometimes it gets so wrapped up in nonsense processes that we create, it's a bit hard to determine what it's for, other than writing a lot of documentation. But the real reality of what performance management is about how do I improve performance. So then, I've got this workforce now, which is much more diverse. I've got some young, thrusting 22-year-old who's in my face all the time, Monday to Friday, probably outside my office, physically there and present, which is actually, there's lots of stuff about presenteeism we could talk about, present longer than I am. They think, right, I'm going to get the attention of the boss if I'm there always before and after the boss comes and goes. I've got that person there, and then I've got perhaps, I don't know, a 50-year-old woman who's working part-time but working from home. And they're both in the same team doing the same things. Where is my bias? Where's my unconscious bias towards who's performing best? Pretty obvious, right? I'm biased towards the person who's working the longer hours, who I see day in, day out. And we have to coach people to understand, how do I make the distinction? Because what I should be looking for, which is the thing that Melissa Mayer didn't seem to grasp, is what I should be looking for is the output and the outcome of what people do and not the input of hours. But of course, if we don't train people to properly understand performance and outputs, particularly in a knowledge-based economy, then they are left with these simple proxies, these simple models, these simple heuristics of performance, which is, well, I just make an assumption on how many hours they've worked. Well, that must be the right thing.
Well, that was a very, very interesting video, an awful lot packed into 7 minutes. issues about flexible environments, meeting people's expectations, especially younger people, concepts about intergenerational tension and output. We got a poll up, and before we launch that, I just wanted to get a bit of feedback from Katrina. What was kind of coming out for you from that discussion, and also some of the points here about technology? So, and you mentioned stereotyping. So, what are your thoughts on whether or not we actually is stereotyping perhaps the biggest problem we have?
I think there is a risk of using terms such as digital natives and the alternative of digital immigrants and ascribing those according to people's age and making too many assumptions about technological skill and capability. It's really something that we should look at, as with all skills and capabilities, at an individual level rather than making too many sweeping generalisations, I think, personally.
Okay, it'd be interesting to see what our participants think. Again, put in the chat. Have you experienced any stereotyping, or do you have experience as a manager of finding ways to overcome that to promote more kind of a harmony about age? Let's launch the poll number 1, Barbara. So I think, can people vote now? There should be on screen hopefully something popping up. So we now have 4 choices. How can you best promote a more age-diverse workforce? A, providing opportunities for more flexible working patterns, a theme from Peter Cheese's talk. Encouraging diversity in working groups. Or is it C, focusing more on the outputs and less on your assumptions or stereotypes about age? Or is it D, working towards reducing intergenerational tension? So I'll give you a minute or so, and while that's going on, Martin, can you just tell us in BMW, how do you go about promoting greater age diversity?
Good question, Peter. I don't know if we actually promote it. It's almost the culture of the business. So we don't really make a big issue. We try and have a very fair and a reasonable working environment. And I think we're very much a strength-based organisation, and it's understanding the strengths of your people and the individual experiences or skills they bring.
Very interesting point there about actually making it part of the culture, but I guess that takes a bit of time. Let's, Barbara, our technical guru, can you put up the results on the screen to see what people are voting, please? Anyway, what's interesting, either way, it's interesting how A gets 21% and so does B. I guess, Katrina, could you tell us from your research? I mean, you mentioned earlier, I have to think about, well, there's a theme in Peter Cheese's talk as well about how diversity encourages more kind of innovation. I mean, from your research, how does diversity, particularly from an age angle, actually lead to greater outputs and more innovation?
If I knew the answer to that, I would be selling something about it. I think there are 2 points to make. One, there is various research or evidence about diversity, but it's not clear-cut in terms of issues of innovation. Generally, where there is interpersonal differences in teams, it can be problematic, but where there are different ways of working, different ways of approaching tasks, that's where you get more innovation. So it's not as straightforward as just as it might at first appear. But there is also evidence to suggest that the more contact we have with, for example, different age groups, the less we treat them stereotypically. So from that perspective, the more contact or the more diverse working groups you get, so tolerance levels will increase and people will tend not to respond stereotypically to either older or younger workers.
So does that mean, and I know we can't have discrimination positively or against age, but should we be actually thinking a bit more flexibly about encouraging broader age diversity in our teams, perhaps, and having more inexperienced people working alongside very experienced people on project teams? as opposed to we want the best, we want the most experienced people?
Well, both mentoring and reverse mentoring, in that example, are good practices for organisations to operate, and sometimes those are best when those sorts of mentoring relationships also work best when they're situated in an actual work environment rather than abstracted from it. I think if you're talking about team composition, it's really very practically about looking at the tasks that need to be performed and the right mix of people to do those. I think we do have to be careful about selecting according to age, which we cannot do. You can't discriminate on the basis of age, but looking at different mixes of skill sets can be a good way to look at teams. You want to have a variety of skill sets. Now, that may lead to a mix of ages if that's how that works, but it's not necessarily that case, I don't think.
So that's really interesting, looking at it from the skills viewpoint, and then that might lead to a greater inter-age, intergenerational kind of mixing up. Before we move on, we've got to move to the second video next, but there's an explicit request here. Dave Stewart has said, as ever, there's an emphasis on individuals. However, it is not the team construct which leads to value-adding outcomes. Would be interested to hear Martin's view on where the performance focus is on BMW. Martin, have you got a comment on that?
Yes, I can comment on that, Peter. Working in the industry I've worked in for a large number of years now, the emphasis is always on teamwork, and there's no ice in team, as they say. And listening to some of the conversations, we almost have a normal distribution curve. It's almost by default. I see it regularly in different projects. I see the young people, older people, and really we just use the experience and the enthusiasm and all the other things that go along. And definitely, a strong team is critical in any business.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. And we'll hear more from Martin in his video clip later. So keep your questions flowing in the participant chat window. We're now going to move on to video 2, which is a legal perspective, although it's not deeply legal and we're not answering any legal specific things, but it's a very, very interesting, and we're hearing from James Davies, who is a highly experienced legal professional in this area, worth his weight in gold. So if we could have the next video, please.
In practice, there are two issues that crop up time and time again when you're advising employers on age discrimination issues. And the first is whether or not age was a factor in a dismissal, and the second is retirement. But the concept of the pale, stale male, the sort of 50-plus-year-old male white manager who's dismissed. And historically, the claims which could result in more compensation are unavailable to such person. They haven't historically had a credible discrimination claim, and as I'm sure you know, unfair dismissal protection is pretty weak in the United Kingdom. You now have to have 2 years service in order to bring a claim, and the compensation is very limited. So if somebody is able to demonstrate that there was effectively a prohibited reason for their dismissal, which could be discrimination, it could be whistleblower or something like that, then you are able to bring a claim from earlier in your career with that particular organisation, and you're also able to get unlimited compensation as far as an award from a tribunal. It can often be quite difficult for the employer to show that it didn't discriminate, particularly because organisations often poorly performance manage. A little bit of a mantra that you have to performance manage in a transparent, consistent and well-documented way. And many organisations, including quite significant organisations, fail to do that. And if you're not performance managing in a transparent, consistent and well-documented way, you're then vulnerable to not being able to demonstrate that you had a proper reason perhaps for dismissing somebody for performance, and you're vulnerable to discrimination claims. And so you get these age was a factor in my dismissal, and sometimes I think it probably was, sometimes I think it probably wasn't, sometimes I'm not sure. But those claims are not uncommon. The other area in which we are seeing issues arising in practice rather than in theory relates to retirement. And as you know, 2011, the default retirement age was removed in the United Kingdom. Before that, it was employers could forcibly retire people from the age of 65. Now, any retirement age in an organisation has to be objectively justified. And you can see again from this graph what's happened. The number of over 65s in the workforce was steadily increasing even before the abolition of the default retirement age, but the rate of increase has quite significantly increased, almost doubled, more than doubled, since the abolition of the default retirement age. Again, it's going back to that being one of the reasons why we're getting an age profile in the workforce with far more older workers. Now, where do we think the issues are likely to arise in the future, particularly with this changing demographic profile of the workforce? Now, I think that, I might be wrong, but I think we haven't yet really seen the implications of the abolition of the default retirement age. So, the default retirement age was abolished in 2011, so the 65-year-olds, the first 65-year-olds to continue working beyond the default retirement age, was 3 years ago, are now 68. But from 2016, we're going to see more and more 70-year-olds in the workforce as the abolition of the default retirement age begins to kick home. And I think inevitably, and there are a variety of reasons why people are going to continue working into older age, not least the financial pressures, because pensions are worth a lot less than they used to be, and a lot of people want to continue working because of all the benefits of a working life, but also some people feel forced to continue to work for financial reasons, even if they were able to, even if they wanted to retire. So we're beginning to see an increasingly aging workforce and more people working well into their 70s. Some employers favoured the default retirement age in the past. As they say, well, we don't have to worry about underperforming people. If people start to take their foot off the gas, they can continue working until the default retirement age, and then they retire with dignity and we forget about it. But people now working to a much greater age, there is an increased importance on performance management. It goes back to this consistent, transparent and well-documented performance management. If you are going to have people working longer and longer, you've got to have a consistent approach to performance management to stop yourself being vulnerable to arguments that age was a factor, whether it was or wasn't. And I think that organisations have still yet to grasp the importance of getting performance management right.
Well, that was a very interesting set of perspectives, and I'm sure many of you face these challenges as managers, or have been on the receiving end, or know people who have been retired perhaps earlier in one organisation compared to another. But it's certainly a very mixed picture. So let's have a look at some of the questions here. In fact, I'll just ask Martin, if I may. Robert talked about his organisation tightened up on performance management last year. Obviously, it's important to all of us, but how do you in BMW make sure that it's kind of transparent, consistent and well documented, to use James Davies' words? Because I guess that's important with a large workforce.
Yeah, I mean, we're an international company and we have an international performance management system. It's operated twice a year, mid-year and full year. But it's about the performance feedback throughout the year, so we don't just do it once or twice a year. We all have targets and measures, and we manage our people in a strong, leadership manner, very transformational manner, and we will give feedback throughout the year.
Okay, yeah, sorry, yeah, I got you there. Just doing the buttons on my phone here. Okay. Can I just ask Katrina then, going back to the issue about attitude and kind of stereotyping, I mean, how do we make sure that managers, when they're looking particularly towards the end of people's careers, do actually apply a fair and consistent process? I mean, I guess there's evidence of that not happening in places.
I think the key is that it comes back to both what James said and what Martin said, that performance management is applied without prejudice and without an assumption that as someone gets older, their performance will be declining. In the same way that we may assume that a young new recruit to an organisation can't possibly be up to, their maximum performance. And it's about understanding that they also have opportunities to the appropriate support, and that we look at contextual factors that might impact individual performance, not necessarily automatically assuming that age is a factor in that. Chronological age is a reasonable but not a foolproof marker for biological aging and other factors. So we do have to be careful, I think.
Thank you for that, Katrina. Yes, I was just saying that Lisa and others have mentioned examples of having a very good process. So that's clearly, I guess, important. If you've got a fair process, then that will encourage greater age diversity and reduce tensions, I guess. Looking at the time now, we need to move on to video 3, where Martin Hall will be giving us his perspective from his position in BMW. So if we could play the video 3, which is again about 7 minutes, and after that we have another poll.
We have on-site occupational health, and we employ a company, and probably in a few weeks' time it may be a different company, but we employ this company, and they're on-site physiotherapists. They have a on-site presence, and they're actually supported, funnily enough. I think our insurers pay for them, because there's some real good cost benefit for the company on a number of issues. And what this does, we have our physios go down every single job on the lines and in the factory and assess that station, how it can affect body parts, so shoulder, neck, knee. And if Joe Bloggs comes to work on a Monday morning, he's played rugby or he's slept funny on his neck, and he comes into his line manager and says, look, my shoulder's playing up or whatever, the line manager can go on an internet-based tool and have a look at the stations in his area where it's safe for him or her to work on. So at least that person comes to work, they don't want to go off sick, we can gainfully employ them, and then we can get an appointment with occupational health and not sort of have to rush that. So that was quite a good tool we bought in 2 years ago, and it's all part of the strategy. We're trying to get people fit for work and coming to work. Working patterns are important. As I said, people are standing on their feet all day long. It's even though it's a modern environment, it's tough, working all day, standing up. So we did some work about 15 months ago. We didn't want to lose the volume capacity or the flexibility, but we put a new working model in at the Oxford plants, and we said to there were some people opposed to it, but we said there's a number of good reasons we want to do this. And one of those is that you work in shorter hours. You have to come to work more often, but you're only here for 7.5 hours rather than 10.5 or 11, depending if we're doing a bit of flexible working. And that was our sort of, us being serious about people's health and well-being. And I've heard some of these terms already. We have buddy arrangements, formalised buddy arrangements. So if someone may be a diabetic and doesn't suit to work nights or for whatever good reason, they can find a colleague and they can do the day shift and their colleague can do the night shift, and we support that. We do lots of job rotation. We have job share, we have part-time working, and we have flexible working in before the law that was changed recently. I think it's fair to say we're quite a flexible company and business to work for. This is something very close to my heart, and there's a good reason I talk you through this slide. I think for me attendance is a key measure in any business. For me it measures motivation, engagement, leadership, working environments. And when I was invited to join the Oxford plant in January 2009, and I use the word invited loosely, but totally agreed, no problem, love to take up the new challenge. And on joining the plant, my boss said to me, lovely guy who's since retired, said, well, by the way, did I tell you your absence 4% project manager? And there was a few sniggers around the room and a bit of, but I took the challenge on. And without going into reasons, and we know the reasons why, we had a massive spike in absence. And I was given a task as a project manager. I was summoned and said, what are you doing about it? It's all your fault. But anyway, without taking the credit for it, we did some great work as a company. Also, that shows that in 5-6 years, we've got an ageing workforce, but our absence isn't getting any higher. It's actually got much better. So what we do, we must be doing right. And it's probably more effective than if I looked across the water at some of their figures. So we're quite pleased with that. But one of the reasons I show this chart, in a spike around January, I was working with one of the senior production managers. He gave the project great support. And he said to me, he said, HR, you're doing too good a job. He said, getting all these people back to work, but I can't employ them. I've got them on brooms. I can't find them work. So from a cost point of view, it wasn't beneficial. The absence figures were looking great. So we took a brave step, I think, and between us, we developed, and you hear that the government's having an initiative on this now, but fit for work. And we had a look at it and we said, okay, what do? We got people who are medically constrained. Some of that's age-related, but it may be more biological age than chronological. Some of that people have had operations, they're coming back and we've got rehab plans. So we combined absence, medcons and rehabs into a measure. And we set up a reintegration forum across the plants. And we found ways of assessing people and finding, well, actually, I can't work in assembly, but I can work in body and white. So we decided to move people around the business and try to really, and we looked at other solutions, it wasn't just that simple, but so we have a reintegration forum. This measure now is in our ZMS target management system. It's now given in the business, we measure it, so fit for work's key. There's no default retirement age, we heard that in the last presentation, and what's happened there, we find now, and I do smile at this, people now, and they're foolish to leave. Why did someone say, I want to take retirement? They come and sit in front of us and say, how much are you going to pay me to leave? Where's my golden handshake? Because I might work past till I'm 70 and I'll be no good to you. Or I might go and take 2 years full sick pay now. And I did have a case of that last year, which we had to deal with. So people are now getting very cute, and that's something we have to deal with. The other issue, and we do this occasionally, and again, it's not always related to age. You know, at the end of the day, if somebody can't have to make a reasonable adjustment to fulfil their contract employment, then we'll dismiss on grounds of medical capability. Or if the performance is poor, then we do it on performance capability. So that's something in our toolbox if we need to use. Long-term affordability of retirement, both to us and our associates or employees. We've now closed our final salary pension scheme to new entrants as the 1st of January last year. It's gone around fast. So when they have this defined contribution scheme now, even though it's a generous scheme, and I will say by the industry standards it's very generous, people won't be able to afford as they retire today. So probably not in my time, I might not have to worry about it, but in the next 15, 22 years, things may not be so rosy. Legislation, we're very well aware of age and disability discrimination. We're also aware of our moral obligations, and we like to think we treat our people well. And we're very aware that there's a lot of flexible working rights given to people now. So there's an awful lot out there we have to try and contend with at times. And also we have to have a look in, we're bringing more skilled work in, we're bringing more facilities in. We do have to increase our technical skills and upskill our workforce, regardless of their age. So that's on the agenda. So if I can summarise it for you, it starts with the engineers. People think it's a job of HR. Actually, it's not. Design your systems correctly and plan to help the workforce age. Don't help an ageing workforce, it's too late at that stage. Succession planning and talent management is a must. I think that's a given in most organisations. And embrace and utilise experience. I think as an organisation we do, and there's no reason we won't go on doing that. And everything for me in life, it's a two-way mutual relationship. No one person is bigger than the organisation, and the organisation has to treat people well. So really what I'd say is, know your people.
Hello again, it's Peter speaking, and I see we've got 75 people joining us, which is pretty good, and latecomers are always welcome. So we've just had a very interesting video clip from Martin, a fascinating insight into how things are done in BMW. There was just one question I wanted to pick on, one from Richard Gadd, talked about sickness absence being a challenge, and particularly how do you manage that for in an organisation which is not necessarily has a high manual factor to the job. So that's a very, very interesting one. And Katrina, do you have a thought on that, about this sort of sickness level? And and is it related really to age? I mean, do we see that particular age groups are more or less likely to be sicker for longer in your experience?
Well, I don't have any facts to hand on that. I think we do have to be a bit careful about making generalisations, and really organisations need to look at their own individual absence records. Unfortunately, there isn't a consistent way of recording absence. There's something like 53 different measures that the CIPD recognise as being in use in the UK. So I think often the key comes in focusing on wellness at work and health at work, which I know is something that Martin does at BMW, and looking at how to support people through returning to work if they are off ill. So it's not necessarily a simple answer, but there's certainly a lot of different parts to that jigsaw puzzle.
Thank you very much, Katrina. That's lovely. So let's move on to poll 2. So this is a very complex topic. We're dealing with sickness, we're dealing with flexibility, the issue of age, the legal aspect. We're building up quite a rich jigsaw here. So just being inspired by what Martin said, let's look at poll 2. So we've got 4 questions there. And really, how can you, as in your role as a leader, manager, or consultant, trainer, or whatever, how can you improve the working environment for an aging workforce, which I think poses particular challenges, to give benefits to everybody? So A, be more proactive in job design and invest in that. Is it B, modify your performance management system to be a bit more flexible? Is it about workforce reintegration processes, finding ways to make the best use of everybody's talent, especially after returning from sickness? Or is it about empowering managers to engage with workforce initiatives that really support an aging workforce and embed it into the culture? So we're really gaining the whole benefits of the full scale of ages in our organisation. So let's launch the poll there, please. So it should pop up on screen for you to vote A, B, C or D. And if anybody's got any experience of, particularly of C, workforce reintegration, that's really interesting how BMW do that. I wonder if other people have got those examples. So if you have an example, do please pop it up in the chat. Martin, I'm just going to ask you to respond a bit more to this idea of kind of wellness. What benefits are you seeing in actually productivity and innovation in focusing more on well-being and employing perhaps the whole person?
Yeah, okay, Peter. I mean, a fit and healthy workforce is a productive workforce. And a lot of our challenges and motives are we want to be competitive. And to be competitive, you have to invest in your people. So we think it's crucial to raise people's awareness, support our employees. But as my presentation alluded to, it's a two-way mutual partnership, and it's incumbent on an individual also to be fit for work. So great benefit to a company to invest and raise people's awareness and support people who need support.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that. Now let's just see what the poll results are. So can we have those, Barbara? Wow, that's really, really interesting. Overwhelmingly, 44% about empowering managers to engage with workforce initiatives that support an aging workforce. Katrina, do you have any comment on these kind of poll results? What's your perception from what we see on screen on those results?
I think that line managers have a huge and important role to play in working with their teams to develop and ensure that the support is in place, whatever the age sort of demographics are really, whether that is people going through changes earlier in their lives with starting a family or people dealing with caring for elderly relatives. All those issues are important. Sometimes we tend to think of dealing with things like age diversity as a job for HR, but it really is important to involve line managers too.
Brilliant. So let's have some examples in the chat. If you are one of those managers that's really making great progress on here, we'd love to hear from you. Some fantastic chats and conversations going on, so keep them going. But we really do have to move on. So we're going to now move on to video 4, which is Robin Palmer from NHS Employers, giving us her perspective on the range of initiatives that they've been working on. So if we could move to video 4, please, Barbara.
So the Working Longer Group was established to investigate the impact of an ageing workforce in the NHS and what the impact will be on staff, on patients and on service delivery. So that's the core purpose of the group. But let's take a step back from there. Why is the NHS workforce ageing? Well, essentially, as we've talked about today, people are living longer. Their life expectancy is much higher now than it was in the past. If we take a look back to 1950s, people would generally start work at age 15. They'd maybe work for about 50 years. They'd then retire at 65, but their life expectancy would be 75. So actually, if you look at proportions of time spent working or not working, it's about 1/3 to 2/3 split. If you fast forward to the 2000s now, you have people starting work a little bit later, so aged 18. Then people are working for about 45 years. They're retiring about age 63. And then they're living up into the late 80s. So that's actually changed the proportional split quite significantly now to a 50-50. So that really needs to be addressed from an economic perspective. So a larger piece of work was done by government bodies and trade unions to address this. There was the Hutton Report and the proposed final agreement. Feel free to Google those. They're quite substantial documents. And a decision was made to link the NHS retirement age to the state pension age, which means that for people in the NHS at the moment, they can retire at the point that they would receive their state pension age. It also means that if there was to be a review of the state pension age, which there probably will be, then their retirement age will go up. Which means that up to 70% of the NHS workforce will now have a pension age of between 65 and 68. And that's set to change. So we do have an ageing workforce. So what needs to be done to ensure that this workforce is supported to continue delivering the same high quality compassionate care that the NHS requires in their environments that they're working in at the moment? Well, that's the question that the Working Longer group has to answer, really. So I thought it would be helpful to go through some of the key findings from the audit and from the call for evidence. So the first theme is occupational health and well-being, which is unsurprising when you think of older workers in the NHS specifically, in some of the more physical roles. You do think of the occupational health and well-being. How are we going to support those people to stay healthy to do the jobs that they're doing? The call for evidence actually showed concern from both employers and employees about the physical and psychological capability of staff being able to fulfil their roles at older ages. So it wasn't just staff on the front line that were having these concerns. Health problems were also identified in the audit of existing research and through the data as the most common single reason for early or premature retirement from the NHS. But interestingly, older people were found to have fewer instances of sickness absence, but when they were ill for much longer periods of time, which contradicts some popular belief that when you're older you're off more. The final one is work arrangements and environment, and this actually covers a broad number of things. I'll skip through them quite quickly, but learning and development was a key one that came up. There is a linear decline in access to training or uptake of training with age. So the older people are, the less they access training. It wasn't clear from the evidence whether or not this is because older workers don't want to access the training and they're choosing not to, or whether or not they're just not being offered it. And that's something that the group wants to look into further moving forward. There's actually, in terms of performance, older workers can perform at exactly the same level as their younger counterparts, providing they're of good health and they have the up-to-date skill set. So it's really important that these people who are slightly older are accessing the learning and development opportunities. Staff experience was a really interesting area that we looked into, and actually there was some concerns raised by staff about how other peers might feel if they requested flexible working arrangements, and this ties into some of the stuff that Peter was discussing this morning. And actually they were concerned that requesting flexible working may lead to accusations of unfair treatment. So that's a perception that is obviously quite substantial within the NHS. However, contradictory to this, there are actually relatively few instances of employees reporting age discrimination in the NHS. So there's this perception that there would be accusations of unfair treatment. Actually, in reality, it's just not happening. And that will influence the way people behave. And again, as was mentioned earlier, there is some scope for intergenerational tension around younger people waiting for the older people to leave because they want the jobs, and so they're getting frustrated. But some of the core products that the group is going to be developing and delivering over the next 2 years are managers' guides for career planning and retirement conversations, so really embedding that conversation earlier in a person's career. Where do you see yourself in 10 years' time? What are you thinking about when it comes to retirement? Another manager's guide to redeployment and changing attitudes towards redeployment. Let's look at redeployment as a feasible option to support people to work longer. And let's look at it instead of just within an organisation, why not across geographical areas? We need to change the approach. We're going to produce some guidance to help employers and employees understand the retirement flexibilities available in the NHS pension scheme a little better. Again, as I mentioned earlier, people just don't understand them. They don't know they're there, and they're not publicised. And employers generally in the NHS maybe aren't understanding that there's some benefit for them too to retain older skilled workers with some of these flexibilities. We're also rolling out a training package for HR teams on the NHS pension scheme specifically, so to upskill them to be in a position to provide good information to staff, not necessarily advising them in one direction or another, but being knowledgeable enough to have those conversations and feeling confident to do so. We're also working with a health and wellbeing subgroup of the NHS Staff Council on risk assessment frameworks, so managers can use those to understand whether or not an older worker is still okay to be doing the role that they're doing. And as we do all the time at NHS employers, we'll be looking for examples of good practice across the NHS. So which organisations are already supporting their older workers, already planning for an ageing workforce? What are they doing? Let's share the good practice across the whole of the NHS.
Well, that was a video that is from someone in one of the world's largest employers, so I think we've got a lot to learn from that. So very strong themes there about kind of redeploying people. Very interesting how the very low perceptions of kind of discrimination, yet clearly there is a tension, and career planning is important. So Martin, can I ask you, how do you go about this process of giving people wider choice in their careers as they age and they want more flexible structures? Maybe not so easy in a manufacturing environment, perhaps, as in the NHS. So have you got any insights on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Peter, and a lot of this is sometimes around the psychological contracts, which will change over time. I think we do recognise people may come to, where they want to be in their career, but they want to be broader. So we look at horizontal rather than vertical developments, and where we can use people as mentors, coaches, use their skills and experience. We try and do so. But sometimes, I have to be honest, it's not conscious. It happens by default, and it goes back into the culture I spoke about earlier.
It's interesting how the culture and things becoming by default. Katrina, can I ask you about that? How do we start to embed these perhaps more mature ways of looking at this issue of more flexible working patterns and careers, especially for older people, so it becomes part of the natural way in which managers operate? Because I guess clearly there are many organisations where that isn't the norm. So what are your thoughts on that? How can we actually improve our culture?
There's quite a few questions in there, Peter.
Sorry, okay.
No, that's all right. I think the key is that we are just starting. In the UK, abolition of default retirement age has really not been in place that long, and I think as James Davis referred to earlier, we're only starting to understand the implications in organisations now, really, and start to look at what those how that will play out. As in the UK with an economic recovery, we may see less of an impact because people may be more able to retire over the next few years than we feared. However, in 15, 20 years, we may find that people are staying in work significantly longer. And so we will have, as organisations, we will have to become better at managing a wider range of age at work and giving people, looking at different ways and different understandings of career rather than it being seen as a continual ladder looking at different types of moves and people who want to have different forms of flexible working. And I think someone mentioned on the chat that that's much easier to do in a big organisation. We tend to sort of make, here we're talking about the NHS and BMW, obviously very large organisations. The challenges are much harder in small and medium-sized companies, I think.
Absolutely, especially Robert Smith here and Vicky has talked about sideways deployment. And yes, if you're in a smaller company, perhaps you have fewer opportunities. Martin, I was going to ask, you've painted a very encouraging picture of practice in BMW. What kind of resistance have you found to implementing some of the changes? Because I imagine sometimes people aren't always moving with the direction that you're trying to promote as an HR manager.
To answer that question, Peter, it starts with leaders. And it's not about managing people, it's about leading. And we do an awful lot of work on transformational leadership, which is circa 60-40 split between leading and managing. So again, that really drives the culture from that respect. Yeah,
it keeps coming back to culture and leadership. And interesting point here about are we discriminating against younger people? I think someone made a point in the chat. I can't find it now.
I just noted that myself. I thought it was a good comments. And when I first started as a manager and I was a young supervisor, you have to break down barriers, and people, you have other constraints being young, where an older manager may, be more accepted. So it's really getting a balance in life, is my opinion. And I think the second answer to the question, Peter, was we very cleverly use our value-added production system, our VPS system, to integrate all this change. So, managers have measured, and it's done in a systematic way as well.
That sounds really good. It sounds like from what you've been saying and what Katrina's been saying, that we need to get a number of elements kind of mobilised here: leadership, culture, having good systems, changing our attitude. It sounds like there's an awful lot of opportunity posed by the so-called ageing workforce and the abolition of default retirement age. I'm going to ask if we can go to we're on a final Q&A, but before we just wrap up with the technical bits, Katrina, could you just give us a brief overview of what themes have attracted you particularly? Any new themes that you've heard tonight coming out of the discussion or the videos from our webinar?
I think I'm going to quote Martin, actually. He has my quote of the day on his video, where he talks about plans to helping a workforce age rather than helping an aging workforce. And I think that wraps up some of the issues as well about paying attention to younger and older workers equally, and thinking about, for those people starting out in work at a young age, how are they going to plan through their careers, which now may be, a considerable length of time, and not necessarily assuming that we have a automatic capability or performance level depending on our chronological age, but actually making sure that we are treating people as individuals.
It's interesting that brings it back, I guess, to we're in the Open University Business School environment here, and of course the OUBS has a strong reputation, as indeed the whole of the OU does, for this openness and for flexibility and an enlightening, encouraging attitude. And I think many of the modules, correct me if I'm wrong, are still very much remained practically based and giving managers skills to deal with these practical issues. And I think maybe we might see these issues around age perhaps creeping into more and more courses around higher education.
I guess so, but I think the other thing you have with the OU student group, which is a fantastic opportunity for people to learn from each other and to experience that diversity, because it is such a diverse student body, and it's a great opportunity, to break down those stereotypes when they work together.
Well, thank you very much, Katrina, for that. And Martin, any final comment from you about the webinar?
No, I think it's very interesting. My only final comment would be age is no measure. Treat people individually.
Brilliant. Well, we look forward to reading your tweets and blogs. It sounds like you could have quite a fan base there. And thank you very much to all our participants for the very rich discussion. Let's just wrap up with, we've got the next slide, please, Barbara. It should appear on screen. Basically, we have... our next event is on the 25th of June, which is about power in the workplace. That's going to be at an event, a location in London. So that's, I think, about the 7th or 8th of our Business Perspectives events. And of course, there are many, many ways in which you can get in touch. Obviously via the website. And I think coming up soon we'll be seeing the email address, and you can see on all the slides the hashtag and Twitter. So do carry on the debate in the on the website. There is a blog there. You can respond. We'd love to hear your views. And we're building up a very rich set of ideas online from these various masterclasses we've been having, followed by the webinars. So that's a wrap up from me. So thank you very much, folks, and you'll be able to listen to the recording in a week or so's time. And thank you to our team at Workcast for providing the technical support and the system for us. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.